A girl with provocative makeup enters the elevator to go down, but suddenly feels pain in her stomach. Despite this, she walks down the dark street in high heels. At some point the girl feels like someone is watching her. Or is it just the wind? As the girl approached the premise where the restaurant was to be, Jimmy sneaked up behind her, saying that she should make more money. Kirsten was so eager to open her own restaurant that she went into massive debt. Jimmy began threatening her, and before taking all her money and leaving, he told her she needed to try harder. This was not the life Kirsten had dreamed of. A few minutes later there was a knock on the door. Kirsten opened it and saw a man in a doctor's uniform with a syringe in his hand. Jimmy, who hadn't gone far, heard the screams but paid no attention. Kirsten woke up immobilized in her own restaurant. The man's intentions were clearly malicious. He picked up a scalpel. Kirsten didn't stand a chance. Successful psychiatrist Suzanne Hartman is holding a session with another patient. Her therapy really works. Suzanne recently returned from Stockholm. After the session, Suzanne asked her assistant Joanne to remind her of the schedule. Tomorrow she has a lecture at the university and then a session with a new client, Mark Zidenius. There's only one person with that name in the database, and he passed away 5 years ago. At home, Suzanne's husband, Frederick, prepared a delicious dinner for her. The couple has a daughter, Rebecca, who prefers spending time on her gadgets. Suzanne tries to be a good mother to her. Before bed, Suzanne prepares for the upcoming lecture at the university. The news reported a cruel taking of a pregnant woman's life at a restaurant. This isn't the first such crime. As before, the perpetrator wrote a message on the wall about loneliness and hopelessness. Suzanne decided to jot down this quote in her notebook and then glanced through her diaries. Falling into an endless abyss of loneliness, these were her own words. The next morning, Suzanne gave a lecture to psychology students, explaining how a doctor should establish contact with a patient. After the lecture, Suzanne went to her office, preparing to meet her new patient, Mark Zidenius. She overheard his conversation with the assistant. Mark had clearly spent his last money on this session. Suzanne politely invited the patient into the office. The guy looked slightly embarrassed. Suzanne turned over the hourglass, explaining that time is a valuable resource. Patients should know how much time remains until the end of the session. Then Suzanne asked Mark to talk about his problems. The guy took a long time to gather his thoughts before saying that he wanted to stop existing. However, simply leaving this life wasn't enough for him. Mark wanted to disappear without a trace. Suzanne asked the patient about his job. Mark said he didn't have a steady job. He had saved up for this session for 3 months. Suzanne advised him to seek help from a charity organization that provides free assistance to people in difficult situations. But Mark was convinced that only Suzanne could help him. He kept repeating that he wanted to disappear without a trace. Suzanne didn't think she could help Mark and refused to take his money. Mark realized that Suzanne only helped the successful and wealthy, those who could afford to pay. Noticing a photo of Rebecca on the shelf, Mark asked Suzanne if she had any other children. She hesitantly answered no. Mark continued insisting that he wanted to be erased from this world. He hadn't known parental love, and it had ruined his life. Now Mark feels like he's falling into an endless abyss of loneliness. Shocked, Suzanne could barely say anything. Suddenly Mark asked for permission to use the bathroom. Pulling a ferry ticket and her name out of Mark's jacket pocket, Suzanne realized she was in danger and tried to call her husband, but he didn't answer. Suzanne wanted to leave Frederick a voicemail, but Mark returned. Trying to keep her composure, Suzanne said they would have to cut the session short, but Mark made it clear that he wasn't going anywhere until the full 45 minutes of the session had passed. Suzanne started calling for her assistant, Joanne. Mark smirked and said that Joanne wouldn't come. Right now it was just him and Suzanne. Moreover, Mark locked the door. Suzanne's phone rang with a call from her husband, but she couldn't answer. When Suzanne began to scream, Mark attacked her. Suzanne managed to break free and lock herself in the restroom, where she was horrified to find lifeless Joanne. Mark broke down the door and dragged Suzanne back to the office. He had spent his last money on this session, but was it worth it? There were 30 minutes left until the end of the session, and if Suzanne could help Mark in that time, she would live. It was obvious that Mark was the serial criminal everyone was searching for. Mark didn't hide it. Suzanne didn't understand why Mark chose her, as she wasn't pregnant. Mark said that wasn't the reason. Suzanne couldn't conduct a session while Mark held her hostage. Her only hope was the man in the office across the way, but he hadn't looked in her direction yet. Mark refused to let Suzanne go, musing about freedom. He wanted to disappear to free himself from all the mistakes he had made. Suzanne stated that she wouldn't want to disappear, even if she regretted things in her life. She also wanted to know why Mark specifically targeted pregnant women. Mark replied that he wanted to free those women's children from a harsh life. Deprived of parental love, Mark knew what it was like to be unwanted. He considered his actions to be a mercy. Time continued to slip away. Suzanne asked him to talk about his first crime and how he felt at that moment. After some hesitation, Mark, following the doctor's instructions, lay down on the couch and closed his eyes, sinking into his memories. Suzanne asked Mark to describe what he saw. Mark revealed that he supposedly saw his younger brother, who had lived for only a week. At that time Mark was 3 years old. Mark was very young when he first took a living being's life. Suzanne kept glancing out the window, hoping the man in the office across the way would look in her direction. Meanwhile, Mark continued to talk about his psychological traumas. Mark's childhood was harsh. His parents were constantly drinking and leading an immoral lifestyle. When his parents, drunk again, fell asleep in the car, 10-year-old Mark slowly released the handbrake and got out of the car. Then Mark set the car in motion, thereby getting rid of the people who were poisoning his life. While Mark lay with his eyes closed, Suzanne kept trying to signal the man across the way, but in vain. Mark's father fought for his life in the hospital for several days before dying. The boy was taken to the police station, suspected of causing the incident deliberately. Mark didn't regret what he had done. For him it was a kind of practice. The police determined that the boy had intentionally released the brake lever. Back then, being inexperienced, Mark had made a mistake. From then on, he didn't make any more mistakes, finding ways to outsmart the police. Since Mark was still too young at the time, he wasn't prosecuted. The police also found out that those people weren't Mark's biological parents but his adoptive parents. On his 18th birthday, Mark learned the name of his real mother. She had already married, changed her surname and long forgotten about the son she had abandoned. From that point on, Mark followed her everywhere. Suzanne listened in shock, realizing that the person in front of her was her son. Suzanne didn't want to believe the reality of what was happening, but all our actions have consequences. Mark had approached her many times, but Suzanne had perceived him as just a random passerby. She no longer even remembered the son she had abandoned. Mark handed her the adoption consent she had signed many years ago. Suzanne asked Mark for forgiveness, but now any words would be powerless. The lack of maternal care made Mark suffer. He didn't want to live with the thought that his own mother had thrown him away like trash, but it wasn't enough for Mark just to leave. One day he met Javier, a nice guy from Spain. No one would be looking for this guy, so he was the perfect candidate for Mark to disappear. To prevent the police from identifying the body by teeth, Mark destroyed his dental records. Mark also stole his x-rays to eliminate the last evidence of his existence. Then Mark, after knocking out Javier and placing him in a car, staged another accident, but this time he avoided the mistakes he had made before. Mark had the rare opportunity to attend his own funeral. No one else came to say goodbye to Mark, not even his own mother. Thus he officially ceased to exist. Suzanne cried, saying she had been sure that her son had been adopted by good people. This allowed her conscience to rest. Mark didn't believe that his biological mother had thought of him even once during all these years. She didn't know that his childhood had been a nightmare. Now Mark wanted his mother to tell him about the day she gave him up. Suzanne vaguely remembered that day. She was only 16. When she gave birth, the parents kicked her out of the house. Suzanne knew she couldn't cope on her own, so she decided to place her son with an adoptive family. Suzanne believed she was doing the right thing because she was incapable of taking care of the baby. Suzanne's mother had never truly loved her. The mother only wanted her daughter to meet her exacting standards. However, Mark didn't think that justified Suzanne's decision. Now she wanted to help Mark, despite all his terrible deeds. But Mark had to want it himself. If Mark decided to surrender to the police, she would go with him. Mark promised to do it and asked Suzanne for her phone's password so he could make a call. And Mark really did call 911. With a trembling voice, Suzanne said she wanted to report several crimes. Mark ended the call. He was sure that Suzanne was responsible for all those crimes because she had abandoned him. Each of us must consider the consequences of our actions. Suzanne told her son that she had never wished him harm. Mark asked who was more to blame, him or her? Suzanne had no answer to that question. She was deeply sorry. However, Mark didn't pity his mother at all. He had no intention of comforting her. Taking advantage of the moment, Suzanne grabbed the first object she could find and struck Mark. Suzanne tried to escape, but Mark caught up with her almost immediately and grabbed again, saying she should never have let her unwanted son live. Using the voice assistant, Suzanne tried to call Frederick, and after breaking free, she locked herself in a separate room. Suzanne called for help, but no one heard her screams. Her hands were still tied. While Mark tried to break down the door, Suzanne tried to send a message but didn't have time. Mark burst into the room and attacked Suzanne again, then told her a story about a mother who loved her daughter and hated her son. And one day the unloved son decided to take the daughter away from the mother. It turned out that Mark had been watching Rebecca all this time. Could it be that he had kidnapped her? Suzanne lost consciousness. She woke up in the trunk of her own car, hearing that the ferry would depart in half an hour. Suzanne tried to escape, but Mark, disguised as her, knocked her out again. Mark drove his mother far into the mountains. When Suzanne woke up again, she could hear the howling wind. Apparently she was somewhere in a secluded cabin. No one would come to her aid here. When she asked where her daughter was, Mark said that Rebecca was in his hands. In despair, Suzanne began screaming for her daughter, but the only reply was the howling wind. Suzanne realized that Mark had planned everything in advance, buying the ferry ticket in her name and stealing her car. Mark intended to frame his mother for all the brutal crimes he committed. After all, he officially didn't exist. Suzanne could only beg Mark to let Rebecca go. Taking an axe, Mark simply walked out of the cabin. Suzanne managed to melt the chain in the stove, and holding a sharp object ran after Mark, who was standing at the edge of a cliff. Running up from behind, she inflicted a fatal injury on him. It turned out that Mark had not kidnapped Rebecca. His last words were that unloved children suffer all their lives. He just wanted to see if Suzanne would fight for the life of her second child. After that, Mark fell off the cliff. Suzanne ran onto the road, and an oncoming truck stopped. At the police station, Suzanne told the detective everything that had happened. However, the police didn't believe her version of events. There was even a deed for the mountain property in Suzanne's name. On the ferry, Mark wore a wig and her clothes, so on the surveillance cameras, it looked like it was Suzanne. She realized that her son had prepared more thoroughly than she could have imagined. All the evidence pointed to Suzanne as the serial criminal everyone had been searching for. There was no proof that Mark had ever existed. It appeared that the river's strong current had carried away his body, and he had disappeared just as he had wanted. Mark had also ensured that evidence pointing to Suzanne was left at the other crime scenes. One of the crimes coincided with the date when Suzanne was at a conference nearby. Falling into an endless abyss of loneliness were also Suzanne's own words from her diary. While she was at the conference, Mark had broken into her hotel room and photographed the diary pages. This was how Mark exacted his perfect revenge. He had been patient and prepared for many years. In the final scene, we see Suzanne standing trial for her son's crimes. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel not to miss more exciting new products. Also, the authors will be pleased if you leave your opinion in the comments.